2 decades ago, a nonprofit organization began trying to fix that, not with a new national park, but rather a huge, privately operated nature reserve, a place where, as we first reported last fall, buffalo can roam once again.
In the winter of 1878, one rancher in Texas gave the order to kill 15,000 bisons inside a single canyon, and his wife laid awake at night listening to the orphan calves cry for their mothers. What she did next, and what scientists found in the DNA of her descendants more than 100 years later, rewrote the genetic map of an entire species. And almost nobody knows her name. You have to understand what Texas used to sound like before any of this story makes sense. We are talking about 30 to 60 million bison rolling across the plains, herds so thick that a Spanish chronicler riding with Coronado in 1541 wrote that they were as numerous as fish in the sea. That is a man trying to describe something his vocabulary was not built for. And then, in the span of about a decade, almost all of it was gone. By the winter of 1877, 1,500 professional hunting outfits were operating out of Fort Griffin, Texas, alone. In December and January of that one winter, they took 100,000 hides. From 1881 through 1891, Texas shipped $3 million worth of buffalo bones east to be ground into fertilizer. They were not just killing the animal. They were grinding it up and selling the skeleton. By 1888, there were fewer than 1,000 bison left on the entire continent. And honestly, when you hear that number, it does something to you. 60 million animals to less than 1,000 in a single human lifetime. That is not extinction by accident. That is extinction by appointment. Now, the geographic heart of this story sits in a place called Caprock Canyons in Briscoe County, Texas, right on the lip of what cowboys used to call the Llano Estacado. Biologists have a different name for it now. They call it the Cathedral of Bones. And the reason they call it that is because of a place called Lake Theo, where archaeologists in 1974 pulled 500 bison bones out of a single Folsom-era kill site that was somewhere between 10,000 and 12,000 years old. The bones were arranged in a circle. Some researchers think it was a shrine. So before we get to the killing, before we get to the rancher, you have to know that humans had a relationship with these animals on this exact piece of dirt for 10,000 years. The killing in 1878 was not the start of a story, and it was the attempted end of one. The rancher who gave the order to kill the last 15,000 in Palo Duro Canyon went to bed in his sod house above the canyon rim. His wife went to bed beside him, and in the cold dark of a Texas night, she heard a sound coming up out of the rocks that he had completely tuned out. It would change the genetic future of an entire species. Her name was Mary Ann Dyer, but everyone called her Molly. She was born in Madison County, Tennessee, in 1839, the granddaughter of William Blount, the first territorial governor of Tennessee. She married Charles Goodnight in 1870, when she was 30 years old, after she basically gave him an ultimatum to either propose or move on while he was still grieving his murdered business partner, Oliver Loving. That detail right there tells you everything about her. She was not the soft frontier wife the dime novels wanted her to be. She was a woman who knew exactly what she wanted and was willing to say so out loud in a century that punished women for doing exactly that. And when Charles dragged her into Palo Duro Canyon in 1876 to start the J.A. Ranch with 1,600 cattle and an Irish investor, she went. She built a sod house. She tended her own herd of cattle under a brand she registered as the Flying T. She kept 3 pet chickens and gave them names. She was, for a stretch of those early years, one of the only non-native women within 100 miles of where she slept. Charles, meanwhile, had a problem. The canyon he wanted for his cattle still had between 10,000 and 12,000 bison living in it. So he hired professional hunters, and over the course of late 1877 and into 1878, they killed 15,000 of them so the cattle would have grass. Now this is where Molly enters the historical record in a way that almost nobody talks about. According to the historian Jane Little Botkin, who is currently writing the first full biography of Mary Ann Goodnight, Molly lay awake above the canyon at night and heard bleating. Not cattle, not coyotes, calves. Hundreds of orphaned bison calves were crying for mothers that were no longer coming back. She mentioned it to her husband. He had not noticed. That is the part of this story that gets to me. Because the story we are usually told about the American frontier is about men who saw and women who waited. And the foundational truth of the entire Southern bison comeback is that the man with the rifles did not hear it, and the woman with no political power did. Charles Goodnight wrote about what happened next himself in a letter that still survives. He said, and I am paraphrasing the cleaned-up version, that on May 15th of 1879, at his wife's request, he went out and roped some young buffalo from horseback in Palo Duro Canyon. The number is sometimes given as 4, sometimes 5, sometimes 6. He brought them back to Mary Ann. She bottle-fed them. She named them. That little starter herd of 4 or 5 orphan calves is the entire reason there is a Southern Plains bison alive on this planet today. By 1887, that handful of bottle-fed calves had grown to 13 head. By the 1920s, the herd peaked at over 200. And in 1902, when Yellowstone National Park was down to 23 bison and staring extinction in the face, Charles Goodnight personally shipped 3 of his purebred bulls north to meet 18 cows brokered out of the old Pablo Allard herd. Every one of the roughly 5,500 bison alive in Yellowstone today traces its lineage back to that meeting, which means every one of them traces back to a woman who could not sleep. Molly Goodnight died on April 11, 1926. Her husband followed 3 years later. Her tombstone reads, "One who spent her whole life in the service of others." And then her bison and her name both got quietly filed away in the basement of American memory for almost 70 years, until a phone call came in from Germany. In 1994, the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department got an unexpected message from a man in Europe. His name was Wolfgang Frey. He was a German wildlife conservationist who had spent years quietly tracking the genetic history of American bison from across the Atlantic. And he was insisting, with a kind of urgency that does not usually come from random international correspondence, that the small remnant herd still living on the J.A. Ranch in Texas might be one of the last genetically pure bison populations left in the United States. 2 years later, in 1996, the J.A. Ranch owners, Monty Ritchie and Ninia Bivens, donated the herd to the state of Texas. In the winter of 1997 into 1998, biologists captured 42 animals. 10 of them died from the stress of the darting and the transport. That is the part of this story they do not put on the brochure. The remaining 32 head were trucked south to Caprock Canyons State Park. And then they sent the DNA off to a lab at Texas A&M University, run by a quiet, methodical professor of veterinary pathobiology named Dr. James Dare. Then, in 2003, Texas pulled off something that sounds like the plot of a novel nobody would publish. They imported 3 bulls from Ted Turner's Vermejo Park Ranch in New Mexico. Those bulls were partially descended from Yellowstone stock, and the Yellowstone stock, as we established 2 chapters ago, descended from the 3 bulls Charles Goodnight personally donated in 1902, which means the genetic rescue of the Caprock herd was carried out by the great-great-grandsons of bulls that had originally been calves bottle-fed by Mary Ann Goodnight. That is not conservation. That is a 100-year round trip with the same bloodline returning to the place it came from. The DNA test had given Texas a miracle and a death sentence in the same envelope. And saving the southern bison was about to require something the United States had not seriously attempted in over 100 years, which was pulling a species back from the dead across an international border, with a Mexican cement company holding the keys. If you stand on the eastern edge of Big Bend National Park in West Texas and look south across the Rio Grande, you are looking at a mountain range called the Maderas del Carmen. On the peaks top out over 9,600 feet. There are 16 species of oak growing on those slopes. The pine and oak forests cover 110 square miles of high country, which is more than 10 times the equivalent forest cover inside Big Bend itself. It is, by the description of the biologists who work there, one of the most remote pieces of intact wilderness left on the North American continent. And it is owned, of all things, by a cement company. This is the part of the story where I had to read the source material 3 times to make sure I was getting it right. Because the company in question is Cemex. They are based in Monterrey. They are one of the largest building materials companies on Earth. And starting in the year 2000, for reasons that I genuinely believe were equal parts public relations, are equal parts a real conversion experience inside their leadership, they started buying up ranches in northern Coahuila, Mexico. By 2006, Cemex held about 195,000 acres in the Maderas del Carmen and was managing another 62,500. Today, the El Carmen Nature Reserve covers 140,000 hectares, which is a footprint larger than the city of Los Angeles. The 2 people they hired to actually run the place are a husband and wife named Billy Pat and Bonnie McKinney. Billy Pat is a former Texas Parks and Wildlife Desert Bighorn sheep specialist out of Marathon, Texas. Bonnie was a TPWD biologist at the Black Gap Wildlife Management Area. They moved south of the border in 2001. They have been there ever since. Their philosophy, in Billy Pat's exact phrasing, is, "We don't wear angel wings, we just try to dirty our hands and make something happen." That is the kind of sentence I would tattoo on my wrist if I had any wrist real estate left. Bonnie spent the first 2 years of her work at El Carmen doing nothing but baseline wildlife inventory. No flashy projects, no press releases, just counting. She told an interviewer, "I had 4 biologists and myself, and that's all we did, catching bats at night. There are 23 species of bats out there. I'd go in and have dinner and go back out and net bats till 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning." And then the rediscoveries started rolling in. 300 bird species, 91 mammal species, 65 reptile and amphibian species. In 2003, they trapped a Coahuila mole, an animal that had not been documented anywhere on Earth since 1951. Black bear sightings climbed so fast that Bonnie casually mentioned in an interview that the most she had personally seen in a single day was 17. 17 black bears. In one day. In the desert. By 2004, they had pulled off a desert bighorn restoration that put 250 animals back on the slopes. They brought pronghorn back to the country that had not seen them since the 1950s. They brought elk back. They brought mule deer back. They put guzzlers in. After installing one of them, Billy Pat turned to a visiting team and said, "Did you realize that the last time there was permanent water on this site was when it was an inland sea a few million years ago?" That sentence is the thesis of his entire career. But by 2009, the McKinneys had restored almost everything that had once defined the Chihuahuan Desert. Almost. The biggest absence, the animal that had once been the architect of every blade of grass within 1,000 miles, was still missing. And a refrigerated semi-trailer was about to roll across the South Dakota state line at midnight, headed for a border that the bison themselves were eventually going to start ignoring. In November of 2009, 23 bison were loaded onto a truck at Wind Cave National Park in South Dakota. 20 females, 3 males. Wind Cave is one of only 2 genetically pure, brucellosis-free wild bison populations in the United States, which means those 23 animals were the conservation equivalent of moving the Hope Diamond in a U-Haul. They drove south, and they crossed the border. On November 28th, they were released onto the Llanos Prairie at a place called Rancho El Uno, a 45,700-acre nature conservancy property in northern Chihuahua. 10 days after they hit the ground, the Mexican federal government formally established the Llanos Biosphere Reserve, which became the first protected grassland in the entire country. That timing was not an accident. That was choreography. And here is the detail I want you to hold on to, because it is the one that separates this story from every other reintroduction narrative you have ever heard. There were already bison in northern Mexico when those 23 Wind Cave animals arrived. A free-ranging herd known as the Llanos Hidalgo herd has been crossing back and forth between Chihuahua and Hidalgo County, New Mexico, since at least the 1920s. A Mexican ecologist named Rurik List, working out of the Universidad Autónoma Metropolitana, has been documenting them for years. These bison routinely smash through the United States-Mexico border fence to migrate. The fence gets repaired. They smash through it again. Pronghorn, which cannot jump fences, follow them through the holes. List told a reporter, in his own words, "That type of barrier, it cannot be crossed by most animals and also some birds." In March of 2020, 11 years after the original Llanos release, a consortium of the Mexican Environmental Ministry, the conservation agency CONANP, CEMEX, and the Mexican Fund for the Conservation of Nature pulled off the second leg. They translocated 19 of the El Uno bison from Llanos, south and east, and all the way to the El Carmen Nature Reserve in Coahuila, just across the river from Big Bend. That was the first time bison had walked Coahuilan ground in roughly 100 years, possibly 160. The first native-born calves arrived later that same year. The first full breeding cycle on Coahuilan soil happened in 2023. As of CEMEX's 25th anniversary release in March of 2025, there are 117 bison living at El Carmen. And the Mexican ranchers who were watching all of this from their porches, frankly, thought the whole thing was insane at first. A cattleman in Llanos named Manuel Yanez told a reporter, in his own words, "At first we questioned why those crazy people brought the bison back." Another rancher, Angel Martinez, 67 years old, "I remembered what the grass had been like when he was a boy." He said, "The grass used to be tall, but too much cattle, overgrazing, left it all ugly." After the bison returned, and after the locals started shifting toward rotational grazing modeled on what the bison were doing naturally, those same ranchers stopped having to truck in alfalfa during drought years. That is not a press release. That is a calf with its head down in grass that was not there 10 years ago. For the first 3 years after the El Carmen release, the science team kept their data quiet. They were measuring soil. They were measuring grass cover. They were measuring something nobody had ever properly measured at this latitude. And when they finally opened the file, what came out of it was something that flipped 100 years of textbook ecology onto its back. See, in 2022, a peer-reviewed paper landed in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. The lead author was a researcher named Zach Ratijczak. The finding was a sentence that a lot of grassland ecologists had to read twice. Reintroducing native bison, the paper concluded, doubled native plant species richness compared to ungrazed plots, and the diversity gain held up even through extreme drought. Twice the plants. Drought-proof. Just from putting the right animal back on the grass. That is the moment the jaws drop. Not metaphorically. Literally, in conference rooms and university seminar halls across the country, jaws actually dropped. Because the assumption underneath grassland ecology for a century had been that grass was grass, that one large grazer could be substituted for another. See, and that putting cattle on a prairie was ecologically equivalent to putting bison on a prairie. It is not. It is not even close. A separate set of studies coming out of Llanos, led by the Mexican biologists Gerardo Ceballos and Rurik List, layered on a second finding. Bison wallowing, which is just the technical word for a 1,500-pound animal lying down and rolling around in the dirt for fun, alters soil compaction, changes vegetation structure, and creates microhabitat for insects and ground-nesting birds that simply does not exist on a cattle ranch. The prairie dog complex around Llanos, which used to cover 55,000 hectares as recently as 1988, had collapsed by the early 2000s. The return of bison began to reverse the mesquite encroachment that had been swallowing the grass. At El Carmen, the grasslands ecosystem inside the reserve now covers 20,000 hectares. The reserve as a whole stores approximately 11 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, according to CEMEX's own accounting. A cement company, of all the industries on Earth, is running a carbon sink in the desert because it gave the keys back to a bison. And then there is the genetic reveal, which we have to circle back to, because Dr. James Durr at Texas A&M was not finished. In 2022, Durr and his colleague David Davis published a follow-up paper in Scientific Reports that confirmed something he had long suspected. Every single modern bison in North America carries trace cattle DNA. Every single one. Because the late 1800s ranchers who saved the species, including Charles Goodnight himself, were also the same men who had been crossbreeding bison and cattle to make a hybrid they called catalo. Charles Goodnight, the man who invented the catalo, also accidentally encoded the only genetic signal that lets modern scientists pick the Southern Plains bison out of a lineup. His own crossbreeding experiments left a tracer dye in the DNA that survived 140 years. Back at Caprock Canyons, the human side of the rebound has been just as quietly stunning. In September of 2011, 80 bison were released from a holding pen into 700 acres of free-range prairie. The Texas legislature designated them the official state bison herd that same year. Visitor numbers at the park climbed from 36,000 a year to 110,000 by 2017. The nearby town of Quitak, at which the mayor Phil Bearfield publicly admitted had been quietly dying, came back to life. By 2021, 80 calves were being born in a single spring. By 2025, after the acquisition of the Hawkins Ranch and the Rocking W Ranch, the herd will have access to 17,500 acres of restored range. The superintendent at Caprock, a man named Donald Beard, has a bison tattooed on his arm. He raises bison at his own house. He told a film crew once, "These bison have some genetics that are not found in any other bison in the world." This is Yellowstone in Texas, right here. There is a statue now on the old Goodnight Ranch in Armstrong County, Texas. It shows Mary Ann Goodnight Bottle feeding a bison calf. Her name is on it. Her great-niece's daughter, a woman named Monty Gooden, he was the one who wrote the letter to Texas Parks and Wildlife, arguing that the herd needed to stay together at Caprock Canyons rather than be split up and sold off. Her exact words in that letter were, "They need to stay on their ancestral home. They need to stay where they've always been." If this story moved you the way it moved me, drop a thought in the comments and tell me which moment hit you hardest. I read every single one, and I would love to hear which name in this story you are walking away thinking about.